the very first people that were in what's known as Russia today, were the East Slavs. And you can see up here, I've got a picture of a guy dressed like a traditional East Slav would have been. But the East Slavs moved in from Poland and the Ukraine and throughout Russia in the 400s. And throughout their time, they had encountered Goths from Germany and Huns and Magyars and Khazars and all these different types of people, all these different ethnicities, and so they had founded all of these trading posts along the rivers in the area. And so what ended up happening is the Vikings came in the year 800, and they started to attack these areas, and they started actually taking them over. And they ended up kind of, instead of taking completely over and killing all the East Slavs or anything like that, they ended up merging with them and becoming one big culture. And so what ended up happening is the Slav people and the Finnish people ended up inviting this Viking tribe named the Rus to stay with them. And so, the Rus, this group of Vikings that came in and merged with the Slavic people, ended up giving their name to the country that would be Russia. Okay, and the area that was Russia immediately was actually part of Ukraine. It wasn't part of what we know as Russia today, but it was known as the KIEVAN Rus, and the city of Kiev became the economic and cultural center of Russia back in that time. So the Kievan Rus ended up kind of beginning with a leader by the name of Vladimir. And Vladimir, this leader, had very close ties with the Byzantine people. And because his people got such close ties with the Byzantine people, they took on the religion of the Byzantine people, the Eastern Orthodox Christianity. If you remember, they split off when it was the Pope versus the Patriarch of Constantinople. And so what he did is, because he had switched over to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, he had a giant ceremony where he converted every single person in Kiev all at once over to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. He had also adopted the Byzantine church architecture, and all the Byzantine cultural things helped to form their culture. And so the Byzantines influenced their language, influenced their art, influenced their music, influenced all of that kind of stuff. The leaders in the different areas became known as princes, and they were given appanages. And appanages are these large areas of land that were given to these princes for them to kind of control. So the guys that we talked about in the Middle Ages, the lords, that's basically what the princes were here at this in this culture. However, these princes had rivalries with each other and competitions, and ended up actually weakening the empire and having it prepared to be taken over. 1240, the group that came in to take over Russia was called the Golden Horde. They were a group of Mongols that came in and took over Kiev very, very quickly. And as they took over the capital of Russia, now these Russian princes had to listen to and follow the orders of the Mongol Khans. And the Mongol Khans at this time, the Khans being the leaders, that's the name for the leaders, they liked a group of rulers in Muscovny, which was the region at that time, and their biggest city was Moscow. They liked them a lot better. And so what happened is Kiev started to decline in importance. It was just not as important anymore, and Moscow started to become even more important. And so in 1328, the city was made even more important when the head of the Eastern Orthodox Church moved over to Moscow and kind of made it the center of that religion. era of Russian history was known as the Imperial Russia, and it started with Prince Ivan III, and Prince Ivan III went in, fought against, and overthrew the Mongols, took it over, and he started setting up a Russian state in and of itself, and he wanted it to rival any of the other European countries. He wanted to be just as big and just as powerful. He called himself the Tsar, and the Tsar just means emperor, and so it's a term that was derived from the Caesar, right, from Julius Caesar, the Caesar, and so it's shortened up to be Tsar. And so the empires of Russia were called the Tsars from here on out. Now, at this time, he also built the Kremlin, and there's a drawing of the Kremlin right here. And so the Kremlin is, I guess, a fortified complex with a whole bunch of palaces, government offices, churches, things like that was walled off so that it could easily be defended from any invading forces. And so he built it up and built the country up a little bit. The next person to be in charge was a man by the name of Boris Godunov, and Boris Godunov was in charge of Russia during some bad times, and so the economy was not doing very well. They didn't have what they needed, so he had to turn to forced labor. He had to turn to something called serfdom, where they had serfs or peasants who were legally bound that had to live and work on the land owned by these princes, by the lords. Okay, and so he started this whole new, almost like slavery type of a scenario, which the people didn't like. In 1613, a dynasty began, and when Michael Romanov, a 16-year-old nobleman's son, was elected as the emperor, the Tsar of Russia. And his family ended up ruling the country for the next 300 years. One of them, and probably really the first great Romanov, was Peter the Great. And Peter the Great did amazing things with Russia. He modernized and westernized it. So he started to import the Western ideas and Western technology from Western Europe to catch up with those countries that they were so far behind technology-wise. And then Catherine the Great took over in 1762, the next leader, and ended up she was known as a wise ruler, very, very intelligent woman, who ended up making the new capital of St. Petersburg, so not Moscow anymore. Now all of a sudden it was St. Petersburg, which was named after Peter the Great, of course, okay, into a cultural center, and so made it into like the cultural center of Eastern Europe and the cultural center for sure of Russia. And during her time as the leader, Russia expanded by 200,000 square miles, got a lot larger during the time that she was in charge. None of these emperors or their governments helped the serfs out at all. The serfs were still stuck in servitude, having to work essentially as slaves, really. And so the imperial age kind of started to come to an end as the serfs were upset, and the economy and the technology and everything were still lagging a little bit behind Western Europe. They couldn't keep up, especially in their government, because their government, they insisted on staying as absolute monarchy and not turning over to a democracy in the 1800s, when all the other countries were switching over to a democracy. And the other thing that they did is, instead of relying on new types of businesses and industry, they still relied on farms and this serfdom idea, this servant, almost slave type of labor. Okay. And so during this time, in the 1800s, the Crimean War happened, and Russia fought against Britain, Turkey, and France, and they lost badly. They were embarrassed, and it showed that the Russian army was just not any good, because they showed up in their own ragged clothes, no uniforms, and outdated equipment, just got their butts kicked. And a lot of them were serfs that were just trying to get their freedom, and a lot of the time they were just trying to run away and just not have to be peasants that had to work the farm for free all the time. Okay. And so freeing the serfs became kind of the biggest issue in Russia at this time. And so support really started to grow for the serfs to become free. And so in 1905, Tsar Nicholas II wrote down the October Manifesto, which gave some civil rights and some limited democracy to the people of Russia to try and keep them happy. This manifesto made them happy for a little bit, but then World War I started, and World War I was really hard on Russia. A lot of the fighting happened in their country. They had not enough food. They had terrible inflation. The peasants had to leave and join the army, so they couldn't run the farms anymore. It was just horrible. Okay, and so Tsar Nicholas, to keep power, tried to take more power to try and stop that unrest and stop the people that were upset, but it didn't work out, and Parliament ended up forcing Tsar Nicholas II to leave. Okay, and the person who took over was Vladimir Lenin. That's this man right here, and with the orange background. Okay, Vladimir Lenin. And Vladimir Lenin was a Bolshevik, and the Bolshevik was a group of people that was calling for all the workers to come up together and control the government. It was an idea called communism. Okay, and this idea was kind of created or thought up by Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher in the 1800s, and what he said is that it shouldn't just be one person making all the decision or even a small group of people. It should be all of the people as a whole making decisions, and that there should be no separation between the classes at all, and everybody should be the same class, this classless society. And it should be set up in workers' councils, which were called Soviets. And so Lenin, his government and his economy were run both by the Communist Party. The Soviet Union was created and replaced Russia as the name of Russia, essentially. And in 1924, Lenin died and Joseph Stalin took control. And he had these 5-year plans that he put together. And the 5-year plans were to try to develop heavy industry and have an industrial factory presence, and also to make agriculture, turn it into a government-owned industry, turn it into a collective. And the idea of a collective is that everybody works, all the farmers work, but then everybody shares the food, and so you don't necessarily have to buy, it's just everyone gets their fair share of it. Okay, however, Joseph Stalin was not fair about these things. He had brutal tactics to maintain his power. Anybody who was his opposition or an opponent, he would throw them into prisons, throw them into labor camps, have them executed. Literally millions of people died in these prisons and in these labor camps. And then, during the middle of his time, the famine of 1932 happened, and this kind of just shows how nasty of a dude he was. And so in 1932, there was a famine, and the crops were really bad, and so people didn't have enough food to eat throughout the Soviet Union. However, there were some farms that were doing okay in the Ukraine, and so what Stalin did is he took all of the food from those Ukrainian farms and had them sent to Russia, where the leadership and the richer people were. And so what he did, and what his quote was, that he had to show the peasants who the master was, who is the master. And millions died, but it just shows that communism was here to stay. And so he was going to force it to stay, even if he had to kill all of his opponents that didn't like it. We already talked about the Cold War a lot, but the Cold War was, Russia was having some major trouble with the West, and especially with the United States. It was a fight between communism and democracy. They were trying to set up communist governments, while the West was trying to spread democracy and just try and contain the communism and not allow it to continue to move on to new countries and spread around the world. And so now ultimately it got really close to war many times, but it was a Cold War because there was no direct armed conflict between the two groups. Communism started to weaken and started to collapse a little bit. And during the Cold War, what happened is the government focused on military technology and beefing up their military technology, but not so much on food and consumer technology and things that would make that people actually happy. And the farmers all of a sudden had no motivation to work hard at all because, you know, the food goes to everybody. And so no matter how much you make, you're going to get the same amount. And those Ukrainian farmers probably weren't happy because they had, you know, many of them had starved to death because they had to give all their food over to Russia. And so that was bad too. And so they had to import a lot of their food from other countries and a lot of their high-tech goods, and they realized that their government can't really improve their lives or make their lives any better. And in the 1980s, there was a war in Afghanistan between Russia and Afghanistani people that was an attempt to keep a communist government in Afghanistan instead of changing. Now, this attempt and this war failed, and like the Crimean War, it showed weakness in the military and in the government in general, and so it led to calls for change, and these calls for change brought upon real change. Real change and real reform came with a man by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, and Mikhail Gorbachev had a couple of theories and practices and what he wanted to happen that I'm going to explain now. And one was glasnost. And glasnost is this idea of openness. It means openness. And openness means that there was going to be greater freedom of speech where people could say what they want without being put into work camps or prisons or killed, and freedom of press where they could write what they wanted to in the newspapers. And what this did is it destroyed the idea that communism was working and everybody was happy because it highlighted the failures. They were talking in the news now about the failures and not just the good things. And they started to give details about the Chernobyl accident and all the health issues that that had caused and all of the environmental issues and things like that. And so people were starting to realize, this isn't working that well. And then perestroika was his other kind of policy, and it meant restructuring, which what happened is he reduced the government control over the economy, started to allow non-communist parties to form, and so therefore started to allow the country to become capitalists and non-communists if they chose to do that. And so in 1991, the Soviet Union broke entirely apart and the Cold War ended, and all the former Soviet Union countries gained their independence. The largest of these countries today is Russia. And so the first president of the new Russia was Boris Yeltsin, and Boris Yeltsin got a Russia that was now on the verge of economic collapse, just about falling in on itself. And so there were some pretty major growing pains, a lot of inflation, high prices with the new capitalism that was happening, and a lot of unemployment. Also, now that they had taken all the things that the government had owned and let businesses buy them, a few people got a whole lot of power, and so they kind of became known as the oligarchs of Russia. And so it used to be government owned, now it's owned by just a couple of people. At the same time, some non-Russian regions of Russia started to want to gain independence. So a small area of Russia called Chechnya in 1994 to 2005 had a war between the Chechens and the Russians, and both sides were brutal, and it was a nasty war that left the area of Chechnya just completely destroyed. In 1999, Vladimir Putin became the president when Boris Yeltsin resigned and left him, kind of picked him to be the next president, and then he was elected again in 2000 and recently elected again, and right away he reduced oligarchy and increased the power of the government. So he's kind of taken on a whole lot of government power since then, and the United States is having issues with him acting with a little bit too much authority and too much power, in our opinion.